Randy Parraz is an organizer, social entrepreneur, author, founder of various social justice organizations, and currently the co-founder and president of the Organizing Institute for Democracy. Randy has spent the past 26 years engaged in the work of building power and moving people into action. His introduction to social justice began when he observed his father, Deputy Sheriff John Parraz, organized the Latino Peace Officers Association in the 1970s to combat discrimination in the recruitment, hiring, and retention of Latino officers. Randy's understanding of organizing and framework for building power has been heavily influenced by Ernie Cortez of the Industrial Areas Foundation and Marshall Gantz, a former UFW organizer who worked closely with Cesar Chavez for about 16 years. Randy took courses in organizing from both Cortez and Gantz while pursuing his master's in public administration at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. And it was during this time that Randy stopped pursuing the lifelong goal of becoming a lawyer and embraced his true calling of becoming an organizer. And that's certainly how I know Randy and his work. And I think it's fair to say that it's in his blood and he's still doing it as we speak today. Randy, thank you so much for spending some time with me today.
Good morning, James, and thank you for having me on.
So let's just dive right into the book, first of all, and then we can branch off a little bit in terms of some of the related topics that it brings up. And I apologize, I have a bit of an asthma, so I'm dealing with like some sinuses things, so I apologize to you and the audience. But the book, Dignity by Fire, it's a book that in its sort of simplest terms recounts your experiences and the experiences of many people in the Phoenix and Maricopa County area, and their engagement in ultimately the recall of former Senator and former Senate President Russell Pearce from the Arizona legislature. And it kind of speaks to obviously sort of the ins and outs and the background of behind the scenes of what was going on at that time. It's really a terrific read. I recommend it to anyone. But I'd like to kind of just have you take me back for a moment and talk to me, given the context of your life and what you were doing in Arizona at the time. And at the time was basically 2010, 2011. Arizona had gone through the passage of SB 1070, Senate Bill 1070, which was certainly then, and historically perhaps, the single most anti-immigrant piece of legislation in Arizona history, and perhaps even in terms of state-based legislation, national history. It was really an extraordinary thing. Many people may just know it as the Show Us Your Papers bill,
Right.
but it was really an omnibus bill itself. There were multiple facets to the bill. And the quick history of that, of course, is that the passage of that bill, the signing of that bill by Governor Brewer, was that it sparked incredible backlash, not just from advocacy groups, but from the political sector. There was a national economic boycott against the state of Arizona. And perhaps that bill also inspired, by some telling, hundreds of other copycat bills all over the country that seemed to just want to sort of pick up where that left off. Now, the author of the bill, which is who is perhaps the subject in many ways of your book, was Senator Pearce. He was the author of it, and at the time, the Senate president who proposed it. And so that's where you kind of come in. Now, what was it that was happening in your life at that time that you sort of felt like, I need to be engaged and involved in what was considered by many people an almost impossible challenge, the idea of recalling the single most powerful politician in the state where they had never recalled anyone,
Right.
and in a country where we've never recalled a Senate president.
Right.
So, what was going through your mind then, and why did you decide to dive into that challenge?
No, I think I can say that the recall idea kind of found me, because at the time when that moment happened, I had just finished my initial reaction to Governor Brewer signing SB 1070 was to run for office, was to run for US Senate against John McCain. but I didn't have a successful primary. And so when I came out of that, I was basically an organizer who was unemployed, looking for my next
It's a
challenge.
dangerous thing, an unemployed.
Yes, an unemployed organizer. And I just happened Sunday morning after the election, Sunday Square Up is kind of like must-see TV in our house. So I was kind of looking at it. And then that's when the announcement came across the TV that by Bram Resnick that Russell Pearce, because I was like, why is he even on Sunday Square Off?
Yeah.
Because I knew who he was, because he was now in his new role as Senate president. And I just couldn't believe that someone with that type of extremist views, racist, anti-Latino, could be rewarded for that type of behavior. Yeah. And then something just triggered in me, like, there's no way we can wait this guy out. He is not going to stop with SB 1070. And so just at that moment, when I heard that news, something went off inside me, call it maybe a threshold for injustice, but it was one thing for him to be the president of, to be a state senator from Mesa.
Yes.
But now to be Senate president, represent 6 million people and controlling the agenda for all of us. That was just, I just could not stomach that. I could not just sit back and remain quiet. So I started within that 30 minutes, started researching what the possibility was. And fortunately, I say fortunately, because not every state has a recall provision, but Arizona did. And so I started kind of really quickly getting up to speed on what that would take. And from an organizer, it seemed initially very pragmatic to me that we could actually get the signatures, but politically, the idea was an impossibility for so many people.
You had, as you describe in the book, and you just mentioned, you have sort of the practical, you need to get X number of votes from X number of voters in his particular district in order to achieve that. But you also had his power base that essentially was against you, all of the people who feared him politically, and on and on. So the challenges were pretty extraordinary. Why did you, though, feel at that very moment that this man has to be stopped? What was it that was so dangerous about Russell Pearce on that day?
On a very personal level, I don't even think I put this in the book, but I remember when I ran for U.S. Senate, and I was at the Capitol a couple of times. That's when all the backlash that you would reference, where people were coming in protesting. He was doing a different type of action. He was bringing in legislators from other parts of the country and showing them around and talking about SB 1070. I remember being at a press conference, and all the cameras at the bank were all lined up, and I was standing there watching him talk about immigrants as vermin. And I was like, you got to be kidding me. He was referring to them in such derogatory ways, and it was becoming legitimized. It was mainstreamed. And I was like, so that stuck with me. But then when he was, and that whole notion of being rewarded for such extreme, nasty views, it just shook me. That's what really captured me, James, to say, look, I have to do something. And then I felt like I had the skill set to at least, lay the groundwork, at least go about the work of figuring out, is this even possible? And so there was, from that moment in November to all the way to like mid-January, I was still working, talking to people, doing one-on-ones. So it wasn't just, I had this great idea. No, I had to go do the work and figure out, can we make this happen?
Yeah, was clearly many people around the country got to know Mr. Pearce because he was soon sort of plastered across the TV screens in terms of cable, 24-hour cable news, and the issue that he was most notorious for, of course, was immigration, and his low regard for immigrants in general. But what were there other concerns that you had about his agenda that also, for you, that it made sense that, one, we need to stop this guy, and two, that I can also appeal beyond the subject of immigration in terms of getting him out of office?
Yeah, some of the progressives who had been here much longer than I had. I didn't get to the state till 2007. But when you do the research, Pearce had a history. He had a record of bills that even when the Republicans controlled the legislature, he couldn't even get them out of committee because they were so far right? They just couldn't do that. This is pre-Tea Party. And then even if they were to, we had a backstop, and then Governor Napolitano would have certainly vetoed. But what happened between 2008 and then 2010 is that, President Obama got elected, Napolitano gets selected to be a cabinet secretary, she's gone, and now you have Brewer walking into the governor's office without anyone casting a vote.
Yeah, she just stepped up for the audience.
Stepped up because in that
Secretary of State, and just automatically steps into the governorship.
Exactly. So now, if you're a Pearce, you're like, whoa, look at this. Now things have changed. Now you can really get something out. And I think maybe the business community was a little bit asleep at the wheel, not realizing what the backlash would be, because, a year later, they finally stepped up in 2011. But in 2010, a lot of folks were just not really having the eye on this, what this was going to mean for the Latino community and for the immigrant community, and for Arizona, right, getting a black eye in the national headlines. So I think a lot of things lined up for Pierce to get this thing through. And so when I saw that, I just knew that he didn't wait 10 years just to do SB 1070. He was about to launch one of the more aggressive, and became true in 2011. He wanted to go after public schools to hold them accountable for undocumented students. He wanted to go after hospitals, say you don't serve people unless they show the proof of citizenship. He wanted to go after those folks who are in housing. And the difficulty here, James, as you know, is that some of our families are mixed status, right? Yeah. Who they could very well, as an undocumented, you can receive benefits, but not for yourself, but for your US children. And so they wanted to, they didn't understand all the different complexities of what you're trying to do, literally, to just really divide people and really make families and make it more difficult for people just to do what they want: education, healthcare, and housing. Those things were all on the table.
And he was a self-described Tea Party member of the Tea Party. The head, if you will, of the Tea Party in Arizona had described himself that way. And so that brought its own brand of politics as well, right? I mean, there was an issue, I think, with regards to the expansion of, was it Medicaid and his opposition to that, which of course left many, many children, low-income children, uninsured, and his cuts to public education. He was certainly not a friend of public education. So there were other things about him that made him really sort of dangerous to the state of Arizona.
Right. He was extreme in many ways: anti-union, anti-worker, anti-woman. He wanted to change laws to make it more difficult to press charges against a man when they had domestic violence against a woman. I mean, this guy was this extreme, but people didn't know his record. And so because of so much about immigration, so for a lot of the voters we talked to in LD 18 and Mesa, which is a predominantly very red district, we use other issues to talk about other than SB 1070, which really brought them on board.
Yeah, so speak to that. Speak to that. Now, so you didn't go to a district, his district. You didn't go to a district that was majority Latino. Nope. You didn't go to a district that was progressive and loved the idea of immigrants coming to America necessarily. Right. What was that district like, and how did it present challenges for you?
Well, we learned a lot by just going and talking to voters early on before we even filed the papers to recall Russell in January. It was Martin Luther King Day weekend. We just said, look, we're going to knock on doors of both Democrats and independents. We just leave the Republicans aside, because we found out, James, there was a universe of 40,000 voters who were Democrat or independent, who we had the names, addresses, and phone numbers. So let's go talk to them. We only needed 7,756 signatures, right? So let's just focus on those folks and we can get to the promised land. Yeah. And so we talked to them, just asked them the one question, how do you feel about Russell Pearce being president of the Senate? 2 out of 3 of the people we talked to said, who is Russell Pearce? So in the world that we are at, everyone else thinks, oh, everyone knows who he is.
That's a good thing and a bad thing, right? I mean,
yes, exactly. It's a scary thing. But for us, it's like, well, let us tell you. So we could tell them about Russell Pearce's views, not even touching on immigration, say if they're a white person, right? Or we could talk about other issues, that he wants to change the Constitution, he wants to defund public education, healthcare, he wants to kick people off a donor list, organ donor list, if they, because they're too poor. So there's all these things we could talk about that he had done, more interested in getting guns on campuses versus, helping real people, right? So that was the opportunity. And when we saw that reaction, we're like, this is incredible. So it was
the opportunity, but what was the challenge? I mean,
the challenge was building the machine.
Not to go after Republican voters, for instance.
Yeah. The challenge was to build the machine. The challenge was to get enough people who would believe that we can actually do this. That to get people to believe, even though we did not have a candidate, because recalls are not about having a candidate, it's about an incumbent, and people didn't understand that. So getting people to wrap their head around that part, and that a candidate would come later, and to find people who had the courage, because when there's a recall, his power is not suspended; he stays in office, so he could retaliate at any different level in terms of a bill you may want to get through, in terms of coming after you with a different type of strategy. So that's very intimidating to folks, that you want to go after, and then everyone who gave money would be public, right? So it wasn't as if a private situation. So who wants to be on record, public record, going after the person controlling the agenda, right, if you have business in front of the Senate, right? So that's why it was so difficult. So that was the challenge.
Yeah, and in terms of Republican voters, aside from the fact that it might have been a much more difficult sell for them, those were the kind of people he could retaliate directly against.
Right.
I mean, those people in his own party.
Right. And so we weren't aware of the fact that they're already within any party, there's always factions, but there was a significant minority faction who were already anti-Pierce in the Republican Party that we found out later on. And so, and then by the time we turned in all our signatures, just to kind of showcase that, is that we didn't target any Republicans, but yet over 10% of the people who signed the recall petition were in fact Republicans, because we ran through the voter base. That means they came on their own volition to the library to sign the petition. So I think that speaks a lot in terms of there was other folks within his own party who weren't happy with his leadership.
Yeah, there's another dynamic, of course, in that district and that city, that part of the valley. It's just a very strong, prominent Mormon population. Russell Pearce himself is Mormon. You were dealing with the dynamic of that religion and its connection to not just the politics of the area, because there are a lot of Mormons who are Republican, of course, but also the question of immigration. What about the fact that you knew you were going to have to be speaking to Mormon voters also encouraged you or discouraged you with regards to trying to take this guy out?
Right. Well, the term, what I've learned too, the term they want to use now is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or LDS. Yes. So that's what they want to use. So I'll respect that and stick with it. So it became apparent that we look at the city council level, who was running the city council. We looked at the mayor, looked at who founded Mesa, right? There was a very strong LDS community and very well organized network. And given the fact that that was the key to power, we knew from the very beginning that we could not run a Democrat. That would not be even a Democrat who was from LDS. That still wasn't a winning strategy.
After the recall, you could not run a Democrat.
Exactly. Yeah, but we knew that in November before we even had the recall. When I talked to people, I said, look, if you get involved in this, let's be very clear. We are not running a Democrat. That's just not the strategy. This is an anti-Pierce strategy, not a let's go get a Democrat in that seat, because we will fail. Because the moment a Democrat declares, every vote we needed to beat Pierce is just went a different direction. And I'll go one step further. The moment we put in a Democrat, any real Republican would withdraw, because the votes they need to win just went to that person, right? Yeah, so that's why it was so important that, and it would have just been Pierce versus the Democrat, and Pierce would have won. So that's why I was very upfront in the initial that, people had to buy in, otherwise you couldn't be part of our team.
Yeah.
And here I am.
Did you necessarily need to identify a candidate before the recall even began? I mean, I think the book sort of speaks to that, like a challenge.
Yeah, for me, I didn't, because I was already going, but other people, that was such an important factor for them. So what I did is I went to the network that I did. I spoke to Council Member Dennis Kavanaugh, who'd been there for 14 years, the only Democrat on that council in Mesa, and said, look, Dennis, give me a list of some Republican people you think would be open to taking on Pierce. And I had a conversation with a woman named Beth Coons, that's from a prominent, LDS family, Republican from the Farnsworth family. And I basically just asked her straight up on the phone. I said, Dennis Kavanaugh gave me your name and phone number. I just want to ask one question, and I don't want you to get involved in the recall. I want you to stay away from it. But if in fact we're successful, I hear you're not a fan of Russell Pearce, would you consider being a candidate? And then without hesitating, she said, absolutely. And if not me, I'll help find someone else. So that I can make that public. I had the confirmation I needed, but I couldn't take that public. So I promised I wouldn't make it public. Yeah. But I just knew if they were there, and so
for a moment you're thinking ahead, of course, but you had the challenge of identifying the voters, putting together the machine, as you said. So where did the money come from? What did it take ultimately? Where did the money come from? Because you need money.
Yes.
For a whole variety of reasons to make this happen. How did you manage that?
My goal was that we wanted to get $10,000 committed before we even filed the paperwork. That would give me plenty enough to hire paid signature gathering operations. As we're building the volunteer base, people already collected signatures on a paid aspect. So, I put in 1,000. My partner Lilia put in 1,000. Chad Snow put in 1,000. His partner Alex Carpio put in 1,000. Ken Chapman from the Maricopa Democrat put in 1,000. Roberto Revelas put in 1,000. So I went and did one-on-ones asking people if they willing to invest $1,000. So that's how we got CWA, the only union initially on the front end during that helped us get started, put in $1,000. Their state council.
CWA is the
Communication Workers of America District. Okay. Yeah, their state council put in $1,000. And so that and then another I think Babette Gordon put in 1,000, and then one other person who funded, who was very progressive, but he just said, let me get this right. I'm trying to get blue dogs out of Congress, and you want me to find an effort to replace one Republican with another. So it had its humorous side to the strategy, but it was worth it, because we knew the candidate would be able to stop all this anti-immigrant stuff that was going on, and that we knew no Democrat could stop that. It had to be a moderate Republican.
Yeah, and also, I noticed also too that there was a consciousness about the fact that the face of the organization needed to be obviously from the district.
Mhm.
It needed to have, they had to have a certain level of prominence,
Right.
and it also helped, I'm sure, that they were white. That it was
Yes.
someone who was white, given the dynamics of the politics in that district. Now you ended up with your chairman being Chad Snow.
Mhm.
Yeah, talk
Yes.
a little bit about Chad. How did he come to be a part of this, and why was it? Why did it make sense to have him as the chair of this organization?
Yeah, Ted, he's an amazing human being. He is someone who I met in jail, actually, when Sheriff Rapal had me arrested and we were taking him
It's the one I
on.
met in jail. That's not a common story.
Yeah, yeah. And so I was arrested. I was targeted by Rapal for basically going to a public meeting, speaking out, and then leaving when I was asked to leave and being outside. And they still insisted on, harassing me, and I refused. I held my
This
ground
was
because
this was for the audience
this,
who doesn't
this,
know him. Sheriff Joe Arpaio was the
yes.
sheriff at the time, also known as someone who was very virulently anti-immigrant, among other things.
Mhm.
And you guys were you were part of an organization at that time.
Yes. Yeah, since 2008 called Maricopa Citizens for Safety and Accountability. And Chad Stowe's never been a protester. He's never protested anything. He showed up out of concern because a lot of his clients were Latino undocumented immigrants.
Uh-huh.
He had seen some of the things. So he was just someone in the audience watching the meeting. And so when we created our protests and they, asked and they adjourned the meeting, he got out to leave and they pulled him aside and handcuffed him and detained him out inside the hallway. It wasn't until he saw me coming in minutes later, they said, "Oh, that's not him." So they mistakenly, our great
They
sheriffs
thought you were hit. You were hit.
yes, they thought he was me. And so they let him go. But that somehow galvanized him to kind of stay involved. But then unknown to me, when I'm in jail the whole day and part of the evening, when I finally get my arraignment, I'm ready to give my plea of not guilty. And then the judge says, "No, before you give your plea, your attorney's in the back of the room. He wants to meet with you." So I turn to go, not knowing who's going to be in that room because I didn't have an attorney. And so that's when I met Chad Snow for the first time, and his partner Alex Carpew say, "We were there today. They detained me. This is just unacceptable. And we're going to represent you through this process."
Yeah, so he was already sympathetic,
Sympathetic, yes.
to what the work you were doing. But why did he make sense for you to become the chair of this organization?
Because of the dynamics, the image we wanted to give up. We wanted to have someone that was part of the LDS community, someone who was Republican. Chad was a lifelong Republican. But also Chad spoke Spanish. Chad was, spent his mission in Spain. Chad was pro-immigrant reform. And we needed to anchor that. We needed someone who could go on TV, not me, but someone else who go on TV and really, show that this is not about just immigration. It's about extremism. It's about, basic decency. It's about other issues that have going on. And so Chad was a very good spokesperson for our group. And then he was from Peoria, so then we needed someone in his district. We found a woman named Mary Lou Betcher, who was an incredible woman in her 70s, articulate, passionate, and strong believer in public education, but a lifelong Eisenhower Republican, right? So then the reason I had to do this because I knew down the line, they were going to come at me as a labor thug, socialist, everything else, which is fine, but he would look silly if in fact we had other people out front who weren't those things and weren't close to those things. That's kind of was a strategy. When he did react, he would look foolish because he would be name calling the wrong people, because he tried to call Mary Lou Betcher a thug is not going to work very well.
Yeah. Did that part of your strategy work? I mean, to have these folks up front as key players?
Absolutely. Function to our benefit.
Right. Now, the nuts and bolts work that you ended up having to do as part of your organization, of course, it came down to knocking on doors, right? I mean, it came down to just like knocking on doors, introducing yourself, and identifying and signing up these people who would potentially be those 7,000 plus voters that you needed. Right. How did you go about doing that? I mean, how did you decide this is the route we're going to take to make that happen?
Yeah, like I said, we cut our universe. For people who don't know, there's a voter file that has all the voters registered, and you can purchase that and get access to it. So we picked out all the voters who were registered Democrats and who were independents, and then we had a walk list. And so we recruit volunteers, we do training, teach them how to have a conversation at the door, and then just go from one place to one place. And so, for example, you'd have a conversation where you basically can count on you to recall Russell Pearce, you sign here, and then we'd say, "Do you know anyone else in your district?" Right? So then I would be on the phone and people, I'd say, "Oh yeah, my brother or sister lives here, or my cousin." So I'd call them right there, said, there's no better way than to chase a signature than get a validation. So we got creative at the door. We had people engage in them saying, "Who else should do this?" And so we would follow both the walk list, and then also personal references.
Yeah. Did during this process, did you find that Latino voters were of not just particular interest, given the subject and given who Russell Pearce was about, but how critical ultimately were they to sort of that universe of voters that you needed to help vote him out or recall him?
Yeah, we ultimately collected well over 18,000 signatures during the recall, and we had a significant, I would say, good 20 or 20, yeah, over 20% of those were Latino voters.
Okay.
And it was interesting because within that universe, they weren't all the same. We go to some Latinos, they said, okay, you want us to sign this, that's fine. And then you want us to vote for Republican, because they understood that the Republicans were the bad guys, right? So they understood what's going on, right?
Yeah.
And you had other Latinos.
They had just watched the Republican Party push 1070.
Exactly, right. So how does that work, man? We're not sure about that. And then you had other Latinos who were like raising their families, not really engaged. Some weren't even registered.
Yeah.
Didn't realize Pearce was their senator because he never messaged them. Most people don't know like where the lines fall or what district they're in. So yeah, those folks, so we were able to register, engage, and put people on the permanent early voting list for the first time. So that was exciting, showing people that they can actually fight back, that their vote did matter, their signature mattered. And because Democrats saw this as a safe Republican seat, they never messaged these individuals. They never knocked on their doors. They get passed over.
Yeah.
So we found it fascinating that we were, for the first time, having conversations about politics with people who had totally been ignored and dismissed.
This was a population that had been there, were growing substantially,
Yes.
and now are a pretty good percentage of that district, right? I mean, they've
Yes.
grown over the years, and yet nobody was knocking on the doors. Nobody was asking
Nope.
what they thought. And so how instrumental did they become? You said 20-something%, perhaps.
Oh yeah, it was interesting too. Then once we got to past the recall itself, and once we got to the recall election, eventually by September, Promise Arizona in Action was able to spearhead the coalition of Dreamers, DACA, Youth and Education. All these folks came together.
Promise Arizona in Action.
Yes.
Is an immigrants' rights organization.
Right.
So they were,
right. So by them doing that, it really the turnout. Usually Latinos lag consistently 10, 15 points behind the general turnout, but for the first time they were almost neck and neck in terms of, because the general turnout was about 31%, and Latinos were just at 30% as well, which proved the point that voters in general, when you reach out to them and touch them, they'll actually perform at a similar level, but you got to invest the resources.
And you were able to explain apparently pretty clearly that you may not be, you may be historically have been Democrats, or maybe you weren't a voter at all, but to get rid of this guy, you have to vote for a Republican.
Yes.
You have to actually support a Republican.
Yeah, our message was more anti-Pearce, and then we went again more pro Jerry Lewis. Once Jerry got, was known that he was very supportive of our efforts. But yeah, it was nuanced for some of the households, but for many folks, they were only voting because we asked them to.
Yeah.
We said, we need your vote, and they're like, ¿por qué vota and por quién? Why should I vote for who? And they would follow our lead. And that's when we started picking up thousands, hundreds, and then thousands of ballots to turn them in, which again upset the Republicans so much that they now make it a felony.
Yeah. When you started on this adventure, the Democratic Party wasn't really there for you at the beginning, were they? I mean, they didn't think, it sounds like a lot of the leadership, according to the book, thought that this was not just a crazy idea, but an idea that could backfire in some way and end up making things worse, which is a sentiment that I heard around the table
Exactly
at that time. Talk about that.
Yeah, well, they function from a paradigm of power. It's all about elections. It's all about taking back the legislature. So once elections are over, they think it's all about recruiting candidates for the next one, rather than thinking like, how are we going to deal with this, right? And so they didn't see the threat that we saw with Pearce. They saw Pearce more as an opportunity to raise money, to be the boogeyman, to be the bad guy, as they tried to build an apparatus to try to figure out a way in 2 years to go back. My analysis was that this is fundamentally about power, and it's about now and the present, and that our families, Latino families, they're going to be hurt now. Not so those folks pretty much all white. So for them, SB 1070 was an inconvenience, didn't look good, but it wasn't going to, no one was going to pearl over Kirsten Sinema or or Andre Cherney. They were just trying to what's best interest of the party versus how do we help
their families who were being
no, it wasn't their families. They weren't asking the question like, how do we stop this? I asked the question, how do we dismantle the anti-immigrant machine in Arizona? That wasn't about waiting for the next election. That was like, we need to take, all roads led to Russell Pearce. Even Sheriff Arpaio gives him credit for being the one that changed the laws to help him do his raids even more efficiently, right? So that's a different analysis versus, how do we flip the legislature? But that's what they were set on. And they didn't want anyone to make it. Our strategy made their job being in the legislature to work with Pierce more difficult. Yeah. Because they didn't want me being tied to them because I was a Democrat. So they wanted just to kind of be able to do whatever they could inside and still move their bills and cozy up to Pierce. Versus a recall is not about cozying up to anybody. It's saying, look, we're coming after you. We feel you need to lose your job and we're going to take you out. That's a different message, right? And so they weren't excited about that at all.
Yeah.
Matter of fact, even Sinema went so far as says that what we're doing was dangerous.
Yeah. I mean, the book makes clear that she was among the people who basically wanted you to stop what you were doing. Yeah. And she's now U.S. Senator, of course, yes. Here in the state, and has been getting a lot of attention recently for perhaps doing things that are not so conventionally Democratic.
Right.
And I mean that with a capital D, that she's not sort of a typical Democrat in many ways. When you get to the point where you're rolling on this and Russell Pearce takes notice and realizes that you're out there doing the work that you're doing, it sounds like from the book that he just didn't take you guys all that seriously for quite a while, and that may have played to your advantage. It was the threat that he was facing.
Yeah, I think it was another one of those unintended gifts. He just kept giving us gifts along the way, and that was definitely one of them. It's great when you're being ignored. You're underestimated, and so we had the element of surprise. He was probably looked at history. This had never been done before. I'm Russell Pearce. I got my base. I'm powerful. I have all the press want to talk to me. This guy is, some union failed U.S. Senate candidate. He's nothing. What's the point? I could just see what he was thinking, right?
Yeah. He had never lost an election.
Yeah, he said he was 16-0. I don't know how he did that math, 16-0 over 10 years, but he did the math. That's what he said he was, 16-0. And so, yeah, why even worry about this? And I'm sure his those around him were probably saying the same thing.
And he probably looked at the universe of people who had voted for him and thought to himself, so that's the base. That's the world of voters in this district, and they like me, so I'm good. Yeah,
and I think he was also so relaxed. He's like, okay, they recall me. No Democrat can beat me. He thought we'd run a Democrat, right? And so when he was just shocked, I'm sure when Jerry Lewis stood up and said, "No, what because Jerry Lewis had voted for him before." He knew Jerry. They knew each other, so he didn't.
Who was Jerry Lewis? Talk about him.
Jerry Lewis was
how he became the guy.
He was someone who's been very involved in education. He's someone who lived in that district for over 30 years. Someone who's part of the LDS community. Someone who worked. Who had voted for Pierce in the past, but of course did not agree with him on immigration. And then most recently had kind of really seen members of the Spanish wards in their church. The wards are small communities of worshipers. They had Spanish wards, speaking wards. They had folks who were undocumented. They had children who were undocumented who went to Boy Scouts in their particular community. And so they started to see the policies of Sheriff Arpaio and SB 1070 really rip families apart, which was hard for both him and his wife, Janet, to see because they knew these folks. They weren't some folks, things that were seen on TV. So what I think over time, Jerry felt a call to do something, right, to intervene. And his wife, Janet, though, reminded him that when they first got engaged, she said on one condition that we would never do politics, which back then Jerry happily agreed. Yeah. And so when he went to his wife and his wife said no, then Jerry respected that. And so, although Jerry kept going back to her saying, no, I think there's something here, we should rethink this, he always respected what Janet said. And then on her own path and her own time, Janet came to the same conclusion as Jerry did. And eventually she agreed and said, look, our friends are getting hurt like nobody's business. We need to take this on and we need to run.
But it wasn't you who was trying to convince Jerry, right? I mean, it was
not at all.
People. Who was it that had the task of finding a Jerry Lewis and getting him to run? Whose job was that?
That was the beauty of it, because once we had the recall done and Governor Brewer had to then call the special recall election, I got contacted by Tyler Montag, who was also prominent in the LDS. His dad's D. Montag, prominent leaders in the LDS church. He called me he wanted to have, to set up a lunch to see if in fact he could work with us. Cause he heard all these things about me, but he's like, is this guy thinking along the same lines as I am? Because we had not made our strategy that public. He didn't know what we're planning to do. So we actually met at China Express over there on Dobson and Main and Mesa. And he was surprised to hear that our strategy was consistent, exactly what his strategy was, to run a moderate Republican, even a conservative Republican, but who was also pro-immigration reform, pro-Latino, pro-immigrant. And so when we saw that we overlapped, he was excited to say, you know what, we're going to draft a candidate. Don't worry. We understand what's at stake here. And, we'll see you at the finish line.
And eventually they found their way to Jerry.
Yes.
But, it sounds like that he was the kind of Tyler, right? That
yes,
he's
Tyler.
The kind of person who understood the dynamics of LDS Republicans in that district intimately. In other words, it wasn't a surprise to him that there was a certain percentage of those folks who would say, it's time to turn our back on this guy, Senator
Right.
Pierce.
Yeah, but even more interesting, before we launched the recall in the spring of 2010, after the SB 770 was signed, Tyler and his allies started organizing that LD18, and they almost kept Pierce off the committee because they started, they had the minority, so they started infiltrating on the LD18 precinct committee level.
Uh-huh.
And they almost was able to keep Pierce off. The time he became Senate president, he came within one vote of not being part of that delegation. Wow. So that was taking place before, right? And so, but they felt that the only way to take out Pierce was through a fair election, not a recall.
Yeah.
But when they saw the opportunity, they're like, no, they couldn't pass it up.
Yeah. And then Jerry Lewis becomes the guy. What was the turning point for him? I mean, what put him over this? His wife had objected to it.
Right.
He had, of course, had a hand in politics, but he just never had not run for office. I mean, he was in that unit or that world. But put him over the line. What brought him to the table finally?
I mean, what he shares is basically he had his own vision, premonition. He had his own conversation, because Jerry's a very spiritual person, very religious, very, believes in God, Jesus Christ as a savior. So for him, it wasn't about polls, it was about, did he feel called to do this, right? And so once he had that revelation, he took that to his wife and said, look, I feel like I've been called, that we can do something here. I can be used for a good purpose. And that's what triggered that for Jerry. That's what happened for him. And then Janet on her own had that same type of revelation after numerous times saying no. And then especially after Jerry got hit by a padlock after he announced he was running, in the growing area. Right? He was attacked. Yeah. Thankfully that didn't hit him in the head, because it was a pretty heavy padlock.
Yeah.
She was fearful for her family, for her kids, Janet was. And so it was a very spiritual, religious process for them to get to the point to say yes to this. But at the same time, and my wife reminds me of this, Randy, she said, Randy, had a bus hit you, this recall still would have moved forward. Had something, if it wasn't Jerry, it would have been someone else. So it was like, we were thankful to be part of it, but it started taking on a life of its own. Like, because Jerry was almost the second or third candidate. There was other people who said no.
Yeah. And by the way, I love it when my wife gives me a reality check too. Things will go on without you.
Yeah, it's not about you. This is bigger than that. Yeah. So I really started to realize that, yes, this is people took ownership of it.
Yeah. Is as you were sort of moving through the process and trying to get to that finish line of the recall, and then ultimately identifying a candidate or moving into that special election, what was it that kept you going? Because I mean, there had to have been a lot of exhausting, sleepless nights. You were running at about 100 miles an hour for a relatively short period of time. I mean, what was it that really sort of kept you going in terms of from the inside, that kept you focused?
It was all the small victories along the way. It was having Ken Chapman, who was the executive director of the Maricopa County Party, agreeing to show up as a private citizen and say, look, I can come and donate and be part of it. I can work behind the scenes to support you. It was having a Mary Lou Betcher step forward, having a Beth Coons give me that sign that can happen, right? It was getting a $25,000 donation online from Domingo Garcia, who I didn't even call.
Yeah,
right?
Domingo Garcia from Texas.
Yes.
From Arizona.
Yeah, Dallas, Texas, who I had just not much of a relationship, but actually just shows up one morning in my PayPal account. Those types of things is what, James, to speak to your question, kept me going. Those small victories along the way were just signs that this was going to happen, right?
Yeah, there was a kind of, I don't know, I think it maybe not quite correct to characterize it this way, but there was some serendipity about the people that suddenly would get involved, because they weren't all there at the beginning, and the money wasn't all there at the beginning. I mean,
right.
You were sort of sometimes almost stumbling into
Right.
these kinds of positive things. I mean, did that encourage you, or did it make you think, oh my God, I could just go off the edge at any minute?
Yeah, we made some mistakes early on. There at some point, it just looked like Laurel and Hardy in the first week or two, because you're just trying to, the clock's ticking the moment you pull that petition, right? You got 120 days. And so you're trying to get people in place, and it's not really going as it is. You're trying to raise money. So I was trying to do multiple things. And then eventually, things came, the right people show up, like you're saying, at the right time. But yeah, there's some mistakes I made. I remember getting a call from the library saying, there's this woman, it looks like she's on drugs, trying to get signatures. Of course, that was the first petition company I'd hired, that hired some folks that weren't necessarily qualified, and that had intervene and take care of that. So things happen along the way and that sort of thing. But for the most part, I just felt the more positive happened. People showing, I had some volunteers saying, what, we know this doesn't have a chance, but at least I feel I'm fighting back. So every signature they got made them feel like they were doing something rather than just sitting back and consenting, right? So this was the way to withdraw their consent from Russell Pearce being president of the Senate. So I think those types of things.
But you had been an organizer for a long time.
Yes.
Was the experience unusual? I mean, in other words, typically in the past, when you were hired or decided I'm going to go after a specific thing, did it tend to be more predictable in the past? And was it less predictable this go around?
Yeah, this was unlike any other campaign I've ever been involved with in terms of what it took to win, in terms of the type of people it took to win. I had never worked in for Republican for anything. And that became, they weren't even, it wasn't even like they were part of it. They were a necessary part of it, right? Without them, we can't win. And so I'd never been involved in a campaign that had some of the most progressive and some of the most conservative people involved. We had Republican women, grandmothers, working next to senior atheists, non-believers in the same office for the same candidate. Yeah. I'd never seen that dynamic ever in my life. And so it took something special, right? People for the very first time got involved. And since then, some people never got involved again, but for that one particular moment of the recall.
Yeah. Now I know that they were late to the process, and you describe Promise Arizona's role ultimately, and they were so within the scheme of the whole project, they were somewhat late to it. Mm-hmm. But how instrumental were they when they finally became part of the effort?
Oh, I think they opened up a whole new option for people to participate, especially those traditional Latinos who necessarily didn't embrace me because I was not part of their network, but they trusted Petra because she has been here for so long. Petra Falcon was the director then, of Promise Arizona in action.
The executive.
Yes, the Promise Arizona in action. We got to emphasize in action because it was a C4, not the C3 part of it. And so, it allowed those other folks who felt maybe more comfortable working with them, and then it allowed us also to touch Latino voters much more consistently and frequently, which then drove that turnout, right? And so I just want to say it was an integral part of what we want to do, because we didn't want to beat Russell Pearce. We wanted to embarrass him. In other words, show that, beat him badly. And I think that them coming in helped us really expand the amount of votes. So we beat him by double digits, which in politics is called a landslide. We beat the president of the Senate in his own district by a landslide.
Now, what's fascinating to me about the people that were volunteering for Promise Arizona in action was that a lot of them were very young. And as were many of the activists who were energized and motivated to get involved in electoral politics here in Arizona after 1070, and really even to some degree certainly ahead of 1070, right? But this was a whole new generation of young activists, of some of them in high school still, and they were knocking on doors. And you mentioned in your book Raquel Terán, who is now the executive director, I believe, of the Democratic Party, right?
Chairperson
of the Democratic Party. Alejandro Gomez, who's at Lucha, I think the co-chair there.
Yes.
Right?
So my co-executive director.
Very young. I mean, they're young now. so they were very young at the time, and they were part of a generational thing. Did you realize kind of what was happening in terms of that generational shift, like during your project?
Yeah, I felt that. And I think I even shared it with Petra at certain times. It's like, this is an opportunity that we could help transform the dynamic, because Senator then Steve Gallardo, who's now a county board supervisor, he said, no, we had never felt what winning meant on this scale before. And so when people go through that, and I'd said this on election night, it's transformative. You can't undo that victory. You can't undo that feeling, right? It's infectious. You want to do it. To the extent that night, I couldn't even celebrate fully that night because people were like, let's go after our pile, right? That's like, are you kidding me? Can we enjoy this one? Right. So I think that's what
I need a quick
expands.
vacation before I do
Yes, I did. Expand what people want to do, right? Like you said, a lot of those folks were in high school. Those folks couldn't even drive. And so they had people bringing in vans to come and knock on these doors, right? And they were essential to it. But then that helps them learn what it was about. They don't even know what they were asked to, their field lead or an organizer. They didn't know what the terminology was. They just had to go out and make it happen.
Yeah.
So that's why
they knew what they were fighting. Though.
Exactly. That's why these campaigns are so important, because it's in that street fight you learn these things.
Yeah.
And after that, it doesn't happen.
But to my point, it wasn't just that, as Gallardo points out, that this was a kind of victory for the community that was rare, comparatively rare. Well, really a first of its kind, right, in terms of the magnitude. Yes. But generationally again, because I see these folks now as the heads of organizations. They weren't all involved in your campaign, but right, that generation of young people then who were responding to the propositions that Pearce had proposed and laws that he had proposed before 1070, before 2010, and then 1070 being sort of the kind of the pinnacle of bad legislation. Right. So there was. It seemed like you were also teaching young people how to be leaders. Exactly.
It's only through taking on these types of fights that things that you didn't think were possible come to fruition. Like, so Raquel Terán, right? She goes on and becomes representative and now senator, and then chairwoman of the state party. Yeah. Reina Montoya, her dad actually helped Promise Arizona in Action find the office, right? Her name is Mario, and she now heads up Aliento.
She's a dreamer.
Heads up Aliento. Yeah, and then Yolanda Medina was out there at Carl Hayden. Now she's working with Arizona Winds and One Arizona. So all these folks that were very young at that time, they're still relatively young, are able to take that experience, what they learn, which you can only learn when you're taking on those campaigns, right? Yeah. And then catapult it to the next level.
Yeah, you mentioned the business community earlier, kind of also being late to the game. I think that's my assessment as well. They took too long to come out of the blocks, or they were too afraid, or in fact, I recall being at a meeting, because at that time I was doing communications work with the Arizona Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, and being at a meeting where Glenn Hammer was there. He was then the head of the Arizona Chamber of Commerce, and I heard those words come out of his mouth. The idea that we shouldn't go after this guy, that this is a fool's errand to try to take him down, because you won't win and it'll just piss him off and everything will be worse and he'll come after us. And I remember thinking to myself, that's an extremely cynical view of what democracy, I think, is supposed to be about. But they eventually started to come around and all of that. Right. I have this theory, and tell me what you think of it, that in about the time that I came to this state, which would have been late 90s, and certainly before that, the real power base in the state was what was happening at the legislature, of course, whoever the governor was, and the business community, and that everyone else was sort of superfluous to the conversation. It seems like what happened during that period of time, 2010, 11, and even beyond that, was that there was a shift, a kind of sharing of the power base. That had a lot to do with the kind of effort that you drove, the reaction to 1070, later on the ouster of Sheriff Arpaio, that it's no longer in this state just about the business community and the legislature, that there's a whole group of people like yourself and Raquel Terán and so on and so forth that are out there and that are a force to be reckoned with. I mean, what's your assessment?
Well, if we so choose, and I say that because for the first time, we had citizens come together and force a special recall election on one of the most powerful persons. That was just like unheard of, right? Yeah. And there's nothing stopping that from happening again. But it just takes leadership. I wasn't wearing a cape and a superhero outfit when I came here. I just looked at differently that it's like you put a recipe together with different ingredients, you can create a different outcome, right? And so I just basically looked at it differently and was able to pull the right people together, had conversations, right? And was open to this idea that we can make it happen, because the recall in itself is not new. It's been on the books for 100 years, but it was new that someone actually took that seriously and can move forward. And the business community and other folks, other traditional players, I understand how the status quo is reluctant to embrace that, because now you're changing the power structure.
Yeah.
And also when like, for example, when we
it
were
threatens their own base. It threatens
exactly,
their own power
and all of that, though, when I was successful, I knew it was going to happen, because all the traditional Latino organizations, other progressive, because what happens when you do this, it's almost an indictment on the status quo, saying, look what we did. You weren't supposed to, you were, in other words, you were standing in the doorway of justice. Yeah. Because with your cynicism, your inability to be creative, lack of imagination, you couldn't see this as an opportunity. You wanted to shut it down because it wasn't your idea. Yeah. It wasn't something that spoke to, versus saying, what's the idea we need now to stop Pierce? You're basically like, this doesn't fit into our understanding. And so a lot of times organizing that whole, the status quo organization, they also can be an impediment to change if in fact they don't feel it's their particular issue.
Yeah, yeah. Was that the Democratic leadership at the time?
That was them. That was organizations like Promise Arizona, an action, Petra saying, it has to be kind of like Petra, it's bigger. It's not about having a candidate, it's about this is the right fight, like in January and February, March. And she just was so more engaged in, well, you don't have a candidate. I'm like, well, why would I want a candidate? Because if we have a candidate now, if I'm Pierce, I'm going to destroy this person before there's even an election. It's like, so it was just their way of like not wanting to deal with this situation, because people thought it was just my thing, and it was so much bigger than me. I could not recall anybody. Yeah. I had to build up a machine and create a movement that could do it, because when I both know one person cannot do this. Yeah. And so you have to like have people start to take ownership of it. And I think that was what's underlying. Hopefully people learn about this, that there's people out there that will take on if you create space for them. And that's what I think I was able to do, create space for the people to take ownership and run with it.
Yeah, but there were Democratic leaders who were literally picking up the phone and calling you and saying, stop doing this.
Right.
Just stop this now. In fact, you recount a conversation with Kirsten Sinema in which she's just blunt, like, I'm telling you not to do this, that kind of thing. So these were people who were afraid to kind of rock the boat.
Yeah, and I think Paul Castaneda understood it the best. At the time, he was president of a local 7019 CWA. And to the point that you mentioned earlier, well, to Glenn Hamer's point, other people said the same thing. Well, if we do this, he's going to come after us. He's going to be upset. And he was like, he's going to do it anyway. He's already upset. He's already pissed off. He hates unions. He hates immigrants. He hates Latinos. Like, he's already there. So he's not going to be more there. He's going to be, so might as well take him on.
And he also hated immigrants more than he loved business.
Yes.
Like I asked him one time, Mike, I said, 1070's passed. There's this economic boycott, and a rough estimate is that up until now, this was right after 1070 passed, that $500 million has been lost in tourism and convention business. And what do you think about that? His response was, I don't care.
Exactly.
I mean, that was his response. So the business community should have been terrified from the outset, right? And again, they took a long time to come around.
Right. Yeah. I don't recall getting any calls from any business leaders almost through the whole campaign, even afterwards. It just was not something that people thought they were want to be associated or to be touched by. So it was fascinating. Yeah, it really was fascinating.
So I want to ask what has come of it now, what the legacy of that is. I had mentioned to someone the other day that when what was it, Senate Bill 1062, which was basically an anti-gay Senate bill, was proposed, that one of the memories I have is that the response by the business community to that was very different than the response to 1070, because they had already been through the economic boycott, right? So they like literally, and I'm not exaggerating, they rushed to the Capitol lawn, held a press conference and said, this bill is a bad idea. We're not anti-gay. Don't boycott us, and that kind of thing. And so, so we saw kind of the legacy to some degree of all of the reaction to 1070. What's the legacy of this particular effort that you were involved in with regards to the recall of Pierce?
Yeah, I think there's a couple points. The first being is that citizens can, should, and must get involved when the prevailing institutions, whether it be parties or businesses, fail to hold certain politicians accountable. And it can be done. It can be done successfully. That's number one. The second thing is that because of SB 10, because of the recall and removing Pierce from office and the strategy we implemented, it sent such a powerful message that we went from being ground zero in the fight against anti-immigrant legislation to almost zero tolerance. There hasn't been any anti-immigrant bill on the scale of SB 1070 that's been considered and passed and signed by the governor in the last decade, which was huge given how dark it was in 2010. And the third thing I'll say legacy is Medicaid expansion. as of the most recent numbers, close to 500,000 low-income Arizonans now have health care coverage. If Russell Pearce had been in the president's Senate, that conversation would not even happen. That would never, he would never allow that to go forward. He was so against that. And Brewer would not have the room to maneuver. But with someone like Jerry Lewis getting elected and then Bob Worsley, they were much open to a minority of the senators were there enough to help get that through and get to the governor's desk to be signed. So that's an incredible legacy because of the work that we did. And that was one of those unintended victories that we didn't think of because we didn't realize all the private conversations were going around, but that allowed that to move forward. And even Steve Pearce, who became Senate president and then was around, said that's—
It wasn't related to him, by the way.
No, not related to Russell Pearce, but he said that was Medicaid expansion never would have happened if Pearce had not been recalled.
Yeah, and I mean, and those in terms of—
That's huge.
Yeah, all of those are monumental things. Now, take it one step further. Have people taken the lessons? Have they observed that legacy and applied it in a way that has also produced results in terms of Arizona politics?
I think in some ways, yes, in some ways, no. I think in some ways, some of the statewide propositions and referendums that now they're going to citizens and trying to say, look, we need to, the legislature doesn't deliver on this, so they're going to go and do the work and raise the money to get these signatures so that we can empower ourselves and let them know they do something wrong. So now you're aware, I'm sure, of the referendum that's going to be to revoke the ban on in-state tuition for Dreamers because of a couple of Republicans sided with them, all the Democrats. That's now going to be one of the things people can vote on to say that was wrong. We need to set that record straight. So I think that sense it's had that type of effect that you don't have to sit back and take what the legislature gives you.
Right.
On the other hand,
and recently, last couple of years, what was it? Proposition 208, the education fund.
Yes, there's like 3 of those going to be on. Yeah, they're going to be on the ballot.
Yeah.
So that's good. In terms of Democrats and Republicans working on, especially because right now most of the crazy politics seems to come from the right.
Yes.
Right. I guarantee you that strategy that we use, because we haven't talked about it, that was a special recall election. Then we went in and got involved in a Republican primary, and helped Bob Worsley beat Pearce again the second time by double digits. That's because we crossed over Democrats and independents and got them to turn out for the first time in a Republican primary, and we beat them again by double digits. That model has not been used to modify or to some of these, or make to moderate the some of these other legislation and go after them, which I think is that needs to be replicated, definitely.
Yeah, and that's and if it's probably fair to say that we need that kind of moderation now more than ever. We need that kind of bipartisan. I mean, the polarization isn't just in Washington. I mean, it's here in the state of Arizona. We have legislature who, people in the legislature, or at least one individual in the legislature, who was at the Capitol assault on January 6th, and and he was there.
Yes, big. So what I'm looking at, and to tell you, the strategy to Bob Worsley, that was much easier than the recall, which is a much heavier lift. So we're coming back to Arizona. I think there's opportunities where there's extremism that, Democrats and Republicans talk and find a candidate that can actually make it better for everyone. But the parties aren't set up for those conversations. Yeah. They're just not. You have to have a citizen initiated group that kind of leads that effort.
Yeah. So you're coming back. You mentioned that the other night at this 10th anniversary event that you had at the White House in Mesa. And you're talking about coming back to town. Why are you coming back to town? You're welcome to, of course, but
yes,
what's bringing Randy and his family back to Arizona? What's driving you here?
It was basically Lily and I. We left Arizona, went to DC for a few years, and then we went back to Sacramento for my wife to pursue a job with a federal judge. And that's coming up to the end. That term is coming up at the end of December. And we finally said, where do we want to go next? Because I'm from Sacramento. We could stay here. And we both decided that home for us is Arizona. And so before she even had her next job, before I had my next job, we said, look, we're going to go buy a home. We're going to go back to Arizona. And we're going to make the best of it. Not for a couple of years. We want to go back and just live. And our son now, Leonel, is 4 years old. He was another factor. We don't have the support here in Sacramento that we want. It's very hard, as you're trying to have both people have careers and taking care of a 4-year-old, then get to school. We just need a bigger family, of extended family, and we have that in Arizona. And so we're excited. But you probably saw some of that at the party. A lot of that event took place because the people that are close to us were able to do a lot of that the volunteer work to make it happen. Yeah. And so that's the main reason why we're coming back. And on a professional level, I'm glad we go back to Arizona because there's so many opportunities. And when I go back to Arizona, I don't have to start over. I can have a base of people I can work with and then think about what do I want to take on next. So that's kind of what drove our thinking on why we're going back to Arizona.
And is there something specifically that you're already doing or going to be doing as an organizer?
Right, I see myself getting involved in the fight to support the in-state, the ban on to revoke the ban on in-state tuition for Dreamers. That's one fight. But the other fight is, I really take personal what they did when they criminalized, democracy. When they basically said that if you, James, go out and talk to somebody and you carry their ballot and successfully help them turn their ballot in, you can go to jail. Right. Make that a felony. That's just wrong. Yeah. That's just wrong. So part of me is like, I don't want to file a lawsuit. What's the public campaign that I could launch that could just make them look foolish for doing something like that? So I'm playing with that idea.
Yeah, you tongue-in-cheek perhaps referred at the microphone the other night to the fact that you have no interest in running against Senator Kelly, but again, it was there was a sort of a wry smile on your face. Is the suggestion that you might be interested in running against a certain other senator named Kirsten Sinema?
I'm open to do whatever it takes to hold someone like her accountable so that she delivers on the best laws, programs, agenda for Arizonans. To the extent that she doesn't do that, I'm open to working as part of a campaign, being part of a campaign. It just depends, but it's still a ways away. But anyone that takes that challenge, she's formidable. You have to respect what she's accomplished, the amount of money she's raised, her effectiveness as a politician, someone who redid her whole politics over a 10-year period of time to get where she's at. So it's not something you can just, scoff at and say, oh yeah, anyone can take her on. No, it's a serious challenge.
A lot of people have suggested that she is not the person that they even elected, much less what she was 10 or 15 years ago. What's your assessment?
James, I think that's, I think people who say that are denial. They refuse to see who she is. She's definitely showed her colors before she's done what she's done, about what she's willing to do to maintain her position of power and privilege and get there. I mean, she's done that. She did that during the recall. She's done that since then. When she was in Congress, before she was a senator, she had one of the most conservative records of a member of Congress that I came to find out. So she's shown who she is. She was part of she got elected in a swing district, I think it was CD9, and which I think has become more progressive, but she's been there. So people who say that, they don't really want to see who she's become. They want to hold on to what she was maybe in 2002 or 2006. But she's definitely signaled where she's going, and she's pretty proud of where she's at and feels comfortable in that skin.
Yeah, but you're not completely throwing out the possibility that you might run.
I'm open to it. Me or someone else, whoever's the best candidate. And unlike before, I would never get into a situation where there's like 4 or 5 candidates going at it. It's just silly. It's not the right strategy. It's got to be a one-on-one competition in the primary.
Yeah. Finally, if we can kind of start to wrap up, what needs to happen in terms of what's coming up in terms of this next election cycle? We are dealing with some extremely ugly dynamics. A Republican Party in this state that has locked itself in with President Trump or former President Trump on the idea that he may have won the election, and they had to go through a voter recount and pay extraordinary amounts of money. And frankly, it's on many levels such an embarrassing sort of thing, but they've sort of put themselves in a category in which it's about Trumpism as a dominant force, even in the Arizona Republican Party, which of course suggests that someone like Kari Lake, who was all in with Trump, the former newscaster, who's now running for governor, could very well end up being their nominee to run for governor. And where does that leave everyone else who's outside of that party? I mean, I would welcome those challenges, those fights. We can win. Let me tell you why. All we got to do is focus on those messages that really resonate with both Democrats and Republicans. So, for example, in 2016, Trump won Arizona by 45,000 votes. Yeah. Paul Penzone beat Sheriff Arpaio by 200,000 in Maricopa County. Yeah. That's how you win. So Trump wins a state, but he loses. So there's ways you can, depends on what issues you focus on, right? So I think that's where the challenge comes. You have to believe, if you don't have all the votes to win in your particular party, then you got to figure out what's that strategy to get those other Republicans on board. And we know there's a significant minority of Republicans who cannot stand Trump. So, but you have to appeal to them, right? So you can't run a far left message, even though you may be far left. You got to figure out what's the right message that lets them feel good about voting for a candidate that's going to be
reliable, sane, consistent, kind, understanding, those things, I think the Republicans would support that. So I would welcome the fight take on Trump, because we beat him before, we can beat him again. And, you know, we had Trump-like people before Trump even took the national stage, and Pierce and Arpaio, and they're gone, right? So that's a fight I'm excited to take on.
Yeah, and it's probably a safe bet. I'm just guessing. I don't want to put words in your mouth that you're not going to run for governor in this next election cycle. No. But do you see yourself being involved in those campaigns and somehow involved in the process of?
I'll be involved, James, but it depends. I'm not one who's all about, you know, we got to elect the right candidate, or candidates are going to save us. Okay. It's just not me. I'm more into like, how do we engage people to build the power to hold people accountable? And so, of course, like anyone, I'm going to vote, but the extent to which where I'm putting my energy and my time and attention, you know, I don't know if it's going to be behind a particular candidate. It might be doing something else to mobilize people, right, to get engaged. So I think that's how I approach it. I'm not one that any one candidate can save us.
Okay. All right. Randy Parraz, thank you so much for the conversation. The book is Dignity of Fire. It's available now on Amazon, I guess.
Yeah, you can go to dignitybyfire.com.
Dignitybyfire.com.
And find the link to purchase the book.
Okay. It's a great read. I just finished it last night and stayed up a little bit late, but it's a great read, and tells the story of perhaps one of the most unique periods in Arizona history, period. So if you want to learn about that whole time, please check the book out. Randy, good luck in your move back and whatever you decide to do. And thank you so much for taking the time today.
Thank you, James. I really enjoyed the conversation.